The lesson comes from Genesis chapter 32. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan. And now I have become two companies. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. So he spent that night there. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. It has been fun over this last few weeks to really be kind of going into the Old Testament again, but also to be reminding ourselves that, first of all, these stories are so wonderful and alive. I mean, when you actually hear them as story, and not try to say, did this really happen, but instead allow yourself to kind of sink into the drama of the story, and to recognize that as the people are doing these stories, you know, is Isaac here with us this morning? I had to kind of explain to Isaac, because remember last week we had the story of Isaac, and do you remember Yitzhak? Yitzhak in Hebrew means mocking laughter. And poor Isaac was kind of going, oh no, you know, my name. And I said, don't worry, Isaac, don't worry. I said, it could have been worse. Your name could have been Adam, which means red mud. Or your name could have been Wesley, which means western meadow in Old English. I mean, can you imagine? Hi, this is Pastor Western Meadow. You know, people think, wow, okay, this guy's kind of weird. We just kind of take names for granted. And we just think, oh, it's just a name. It sounds good. It's in the Bible. Jacob. Do we have any Jacobs here? Jacob's another one. I mean, how many of you know Jacobs? I mean, it is so popular. But the name Jacob, Yaqub in Hebrew, means the cheater, or the usurper, the one who was kind of pulling other people down to make sure that he got on top. That's the name, that's the title that this name actually means. But actually, when you hear the story of Jacob, Yaqub, you'll really kind of understand that it really does kind of describe him, doesn't it? Because Yaqub, Jacob, had a brother by the name of Esau. And Esau means red and hairy. So if you think Yaqub was bad, Esau's even worse, red and hairy. But so you had hairy and the cheat. And these two brothers were always fighting it out. Now Esau was born first. And so, but Jacob was his mother's favorite. And so there were always kind of these little machinations going on to try to get Jacob put in first place, to the point where finally they trick the dad, Isaac, and Isaac gives the blessing, and then Isaac has to hightail it out of town because Esau found out that he was given the blessing and Esau is ready to kill him. So he zooms out of town and, interestingly enough, goes off to find a wife in Palouse or Potlatch or someplace, distant. And interestingly, the cheater gets cheated because in weddings in Hebrew culture, the bride wears a veil all the way through the service until the very end. And when Jacob was going to get married, there were two sisters. One was the older sister, but he was in love with the younger sister. Gee, does this story have kind of some funky parallels? And it turned out that, he goes through the whole wedding service, and then at the end, this is going to be a little weird, but I'm going to lift up the veil, and who was it that Jacob married? The older sister. And so then he has to go through another 7 years of labor with the father-in-law so that he can marry the younger sister as well. Kind of blows a hole in our whole idea of biblical marriage, right? Having two wives. And anyway, that's a whole different thing. But the piece that I really want to focus in on is the fact that Jacob is ready now to come back. He's ready to come back. He's ready to cross the river and to go and meet his brother again. And how do you think that meeting is going to be? I don't think it's going to go very well. Now, the interesting piece is that if you noted, in Mary's story there was a big gap that you couldn't quite see. But that gap was where Jacob sends like 200 sheep and 300 cows and 20 horses and 20 donkeys over to Esau as kind of a way to try to placate him, to make the homecoming better. But it's the night before. It's the night before Jacob is going to meet Esau again. And Jacob wrestles. This word, once again in Hebrew, is not Marcus of Queensberry kind of wrestling. This is not polite where there's an umpire that says, okay, everybody up, and we're going to... This is down in the dirt, rolling around, bad punches, nasty... This is just real, gritty wrestling. Now, ultimately, as they're wrestling, Jacob begins to realize that there's something rather supernatural about this guy that he's wrestling. And ultimately, he kind of goes, whoa, at the end, I was wrestling with God. And he gets a new name as a result. Love this, because his name gets changed from the cheat to the one who wrestles with God, Israel. And if you ever wonder, the people of Israel are still the ones wrestling with God all the time. Wrestling with God. Wrestling with our faith. We talked a little bit about it when we were talking about being able to kind of laugh and to kind of enter into it with God and to kind of be a little bit contentious with God. But the thought of actually wrestling with God. When we think of ourselves as Christians, most of the time we think of ourselves that Christianity will be the thing that gives us peace. That a faith is what will give us comfort and will give us some solid, our faith is what gets us through last night. Right? That no matter what happens, that there's always a bright sunny day the next morning, and that we can go on, and we can keep going on. We kind of think of our faith like that. But how often do we actually think of our faith? Because this is, if you're going into the Bible, this is what it's actually usually about. Faith means wrestling. Because I think Jacob was not just wrestling with God. Jacob was wrestling with himself too. Jacob was wrestling with everything that he had been over the last 14, 15 years. Jacob was wrestling with his own identity and saying, who am I and what is this about? And can I be a different person? And I think one of the things that's really good for us to recognize is that as Christians, it's not just about all placid and peace, but it's really about taking some of the really hard issues and really wrestling with them. The Lutheran Church over the last 500 years has really kind of had to wrestle with change too. You know, we've had the jokes about how many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb. You all know the answers to that, you know. 1 and then 4 to talk about how much they like the other light bulb better. Yeah, actually, you can put whatever denomination you want in there and it all works because we all have this problem with change. I remember in a previous conversation wrestling because there's a new version of the Lord's Prayer that was listed. How many people like the old Lord's Prayer better? How many people like the new one better? I had somebody in the congregation that was really kind of put out because of this new version. And she said, I will not come back to church until we have the old version of the Lord's Prayer back in the bulletin. And I said, fear not, it will be there. Well, you know that sometimes I can be kind of a little naughty. And so the next Sunday we had it in Aramaic. Well, Ruth, you wanted it in the old language. That's not what I meant. Well, you see, that really kind of points out that the wrestling that we often do, the wrestling that even we do with ourselves, is wrestling with what our expectations are, with our history. Sometimes these are changes. I remember so well, I was talking to one of our new pastors in the area, and he was talking about some changes that he's trying to make. And he says, do you have any advice? And I said, well, first of all, you have to decide, is it a cross worth dying on? But I said, the second thing is, kind of take it slow. I said, when I was a kid, and if I bring this up, and if I hear it from you, but they had flags in church, remember? Yeah. You know the reason why we had flags in church? The flags were never in church until the 1930s. The flags showed up in the 1930s to have the Lutherans, who all the Lutherans were German and Scandinavian, you know, but to have the Lutherans show everybody else that even though we were immigrants, boy, some things just don't change, do they? Even though we were all immigrants in the 1930s, we were Americans too. It had its time. But then the flags got stuck in the churches and they never moved, even though the issue was long gone. Pastor Boss, incredibly wise man, came as the new pastor to our church in Mount Vernon, and there were the flags, left and right, to each side of the altar. Pastor Boss moved the flags 2 inches every Sunday. 2 inches. So they kind of slowly worked their way around the wall, down the aisle, to the back of the church. And after 3 years, they went out the door. But the changes happened so slowly that nobody noticed. It was like, oh, where did the flags go? Yeah, where did the flags go? But you see, I think one of the things that is so good for us as Christians to do is, first of all, own our own stuff. You know, own the fact that most of the time, when we have a hissy fit about something that we think is an absolute in the church, it's usually an absolute for us. It's our issue. Luther himself said that Christians would much more quickly argue about the placement of the candles on the altar than about an issue of faith. It's the adiaphora, he said. It's the stuff that we like to argue about, because then it's the stuff that we build our faith on. We're getting ready, and a church should always be, a congregation should always be a congregation that's moving and changing and adapting, and, not just for the sake of being cool and relevant, but, I don't want to just have to, show you my tattoos and I'm such a cool pastor, but a church should really also, choir, you do realize that with the way we're dressed, stand up everybody. We could walk down the streets of Constantinople in 350 AD and no one would bat an eye. Well, maybe the eyeglasses might freak people out. This is the everyday garb of people. You can sit down again. Fashion show. The everyday garb of people in the year 350 AD in Constantinople. See how good we are at change? Okay, well, we like it and it covers up the clothes, and that's fine, but at least hold it lightly. Kirsten, when she was graduating from high school, had the absolute best speaker, because he said that what we should do is, he said we'd like to hold on to life really tightly. He said, but I think that as you guys are getting ready to head out into the world, hold on to life like a bar of wet soap. Hold it lightly. Let it be fluid and move and adapt so that you can move and adapt and you can continue to be part. We're getting ready. Libby, I know you're here. Libby back there. Deb DeZook right here. They're getting ready to have a meeting tomorrow with some of the leaders of the congregation. And they're going to be asking the leaders of the congregation to dream about some of the things that we could grow into, some things that we might change within the church, but change and adapt and grow in the church so that we can continue to be a vibrant and vital congregation, holding on to our mission to proclaim God's love to everyone. How can we move into the future? What can we do right now to kind of help us open the doors? Hold the things that we're doing lightly now so that we can be ready to do the things in the future well too. Not just the leaders of the congregation. I would love and yearn, and I think we are pretty darn close to having a congregation where the whole attitude of the congregation is treasuring our tradition, treasuring what we have, but not holding it on to so tightly that we can't move, that we can't grow, that we have a whole congregation that is very open to doing what we need to do. Wrestling with God, wrestling with others if we need to try to really figure out what is best for us here in this place. Join me in that, and join the leaders, and join God in continuing to wrestle with all of humanity. Our name may change. Jacob's did. We may start to change how we name ourselves and see ourselves. It's a possibility. But it is glorious and it is God-given. Amen.